Terry, I got us an intro.
I dig it. I feel like we should be finding our seats and opening our hymnal.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the service brought to you by Happy Jōb. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
By the way, can I say I love the duality of Happy Jōb and Job with his ass firmly planted in fire. Like, I love that.
Is that an actual Job story that he had to sit in the fire? I can't remember.
Yeah, it's actually not fire, but it's sackcloth and ashes. That's the actual scripture in the Bible references sackcloth and ashes. Now, I do need to refresh my memory on what exactly sackcloth is, but ashes is hot. So
hot ashes, not sackcloth and cold ashes, sackcloth and hot ashes, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a carbon spa or some, hippie woo stuff. He was burning.
Poor Job, long suffering, long tested. Do you feel like you relate? Is that where this is coming from?
Certain times of my life, yeah.
Sometimes.
Times.
That's the nature of good characters, right? As you feel, or good stories, as you feel, everybody can feel like they relate. It feels universal.
Yeah, I agree.
I haven't seen you in a while, so I was going to actually have some niceties. And when I say niceties, I don't mean I'm going to talk about the weather. I mean, I'm going to play a round of AI or not AI with you.
Okay, let's do it.
Are you ready?
I feel like you're going way far in the tail on this. Like,
I have 3.
Fuzzy.
I feel like I am playing the dunce, but I also feel like I legitimately don't follow what's AI and what's not to some degree. So I feel dumb for saying this stuff, but I'm not. And I feel like it would be the type of thing I would say jokingly. But at this point, I honestly can't tell. So if I'm on a fully self-driving train at an airport that goes between 4 stops and there's no person involved except to come out and do maintenance, is it being run by an AI?
It depends on how it's controlled. If it's electrical current, as is the case, I believe, with most trains, obviously there's some programming, there's some software or some PLC or SCADA or control system on board. There's also, or there's a main control station. But I think most of those are driven electrically. So I would say in that case, no. Now, if there were cameras set up and it was using computer vision in some form or fashion, then I would say it's AI.
This is my segue. And I feel like maybe I'm repeating myself from a month and a half ago. But is person detection AI? Meaning, there's a video image and a box is drawn automatically around things that are people, and they get a green line on their box, and other things that are moving get highlighted as moving objects, but get a red box because they're not a person. Is that AI?
Yeah, so it's an interesting discussion because you and I both know industrial automation, and vision inspection systems have been a part of industrial automation. What, 20 years, 30 years?
Long time.
Long time. So well before the concept of AI in industry. I think the mechanism for those systems is pixel counting and logic. And so I think that's one of those fuzzy cases. I mean, if you have an algorithm, where, the algorithm's doing the pixel counting, or the algorithm is actually recognizing shapes or movements, then it's AI. But I think you also we have a long history we have a lot of prior art of vision systems that have not been driven algorithmically.
Yeah, I feel like the driven algorithmically piece matters a lot. I feel like dynamic matters a lot. I also have a very not scientific criteria that maybe helps me, maybe hurts me, which is if it's something that a machine is doing that is human like in its reasoning, or is emulating a human in its reasoning, then that always strikes me as more like AI and not less. So the train that has a sequence that it runs through that could have been programmed as it's always a linear set of steps. Maybe it forks, maybe it doesn't, but it's always a linear set of steps, and it never ever changes. Even if it's 3,000 steps, as long as it just goes through the same steps, and every decision point, if you can call it that, has a couple of different options, and the option, if there's a person stuck in the door, you don't slam the door on them, or if there's an object on the track, or if there's a collision on the track, all of that stuff is, it's very old school automation. It could have been managed mechanically, right? There's not even a computer, much less a thinking reasoning. There's no reasoning done at all. But then I get stuck because, a large language model where I'm interfacing with it through ChatGPT or Claude or Bard, and I'm interacting with it, and I feel like when I get the response is always different by design. But that generated on the fly response is critical to making that more AI-y than just a sequence of steps.
Yeah,
But you know what though? Who cares? This is the problem I'm really stuck with. Does anybody care?
This is where you and I think, collectively have landed, and
we're not the only ones, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and this is Callie and I talked a bit about.
Yeah.
By the way, thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed him and enjoyed doing his podcast. But we talked about this: is, do you need whiz bang X? If you're a manufacturer, do you need it? And I think once you get to the crossroads of, I want this outcome, I need to solve this problem to deliver this outcome, then what's it matter how? And if it's heuristics, if it's a piece of equipment from the 80s, whatever, what's it matter how? And I think that's where you and I kind of collectively have dropped. And not that that's a huge, it's not like we're pioneers in this mindset, no. But just solve problems. And
you know what's over the hump though? Like a technology that's made it past this. So this discussion happened, and now, well, maybe this is solved somewhere else. But another topic that is, I would say, equally frustrating for you, and sometimes me. But like digital twin, this is solved in industry. It's solved. If someone says digital twin, it's to frame the conversation around, we are talking about a sophisticated and complex simulation that
software
that may have multiple simulations and has a the words real time are not appropriate to use here because it's too confusing, but it is a short lag between reality and the simulation updating. And so framing that all as we are talking about a digital twin is just less words than saying a briefly lagged complex simulation that is lifelike in nature. Like that, and the shorthand is, at this point, you can tell immediately whether someone is talking about the fluff because they want to twin, I don't know, my studio here, and they're going to put a digital version of me in it. And I'm like, oh my God, why are we talking about this? Versus, oh, we have a digital twin of the F-35 engine that the Air Force has demanded that we include in our contract, and therefore we have to supply them a twin, and there's a spec somewhere, and you can read that spec, and it'll say it needs to do all these things. And the words digital twin are just shorthand for all the requirements that are in that spec for the simulation.
So it's an interesting segue, and this is what I want to sort of turn this into a question and answer session where I ask you questions.
All right, do it. I'm scared, but I'm ready.
So if we're thinking of digital twin, I think like I shouldn't have even mentioned the term, but one of the I'd say is at 1A in terms of requirements for conceptually what a digital twin is supposed to be. You need
Hmm.
to be able to push data around a factory environment. So you need to have all your equipment that is working in the automation environment, the OT network, which would include production logs and a lot of non-asset data as well. Talk a little bit about protocols, what an industrial protocol is, how that relates to pushing data around, capturing data, extracting, either pushing or
Hmm.
pulling, capturing data, and then landing it somewhere for things to happen to that data. So talk.
Can I start with jargon? Is that okay?
Well, we,
It's
yeah,
useful jargon.
yeah. I
I
think
think we'd be hard pressed to find someone who's not broadly familiar with how the internet works, in the sense that you are on a computer, I am on a computer. Each of our computers is connected to a network in our home through a router. Our cell phones are on a cellular network somewhere at some layer that is above, possibly literally in the sky above, or possibly conceptually in a system architecture, uh, above the level of our house or our cell phone network. There's a combined, there's a communication point somewhere where those are then on the same network. So if I, text something to you, that gets to a device that is also on your home network. this the protocols that run the regular internet that we're used to dealing with and interacting with from, like the AOL CD days and before, that internet, it evolved and developed a bunch of different protocols. The most, I would say, easy to grasp for anybody is probably like HTML, which is the language that allows you to use a different browser but see a web page that looks the same. So, Chrome, Safari, Opera, if you're using Opera, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and then Edge. Those browsers are all totally different pieces of software, and none of them, they're not made by the same people. They don't do the same thing, or they don't do the same thing behind the scenes. But what they are able to do is read a file that is in a format and show it to you. Same as like a camera has a certain number of supported image files, like JPEG versus raw footage where you have a much larger file. So the protocols cover a huge number of different things, and there's not one factory protocol that solves it. It is, protocols for passing data from place to place. It's protocols for how you store data most efficiently. It's protocols for how you retrieve data from storage. It's protocols for how you represent the data, like like a web page. But what's the, like, there's simple stuff like, how do you represent a tool, or how do you represent the details of a computer that's on a factory floor? There are protocols for all that stuff. The protocols that run the internet are also used either to underlay factory protocols, or they're just used kind of raw. It's not like we have special Wi-Fi for a factory, but that's still part of the kind of the stack of things. And the way to think about, protocol is standards, specifications, rules, and guidelines. Generally, protocol tends to mean more about, uh, where something, like when we're talking about digital factory protocols, it tends to be something is being done with the data. So a protocol for passing data or a protocol for storing. It's not so much about a representation. So what is the data by itself? If nothing's happening to the data, that tends not to be a protocol. There may be one protocol for transforming and another standard or specification for what it has to look like.
so.
Which this
Can
this got pretty far in the weeds pretty fast.
I love it.
Sorry.
No, I love it. So can you talk about, so we've established, and I've got this question that is a bridge to the next question. So we've established that a protocol is a means for passing data, much like if you download a file on your personal computer, um, all of the things that you mentioned as analogous to an industrial protocol. Can
Hmm.
you pick one? There's a bunch: OPCUA, MQTT, MT Connect, which you know very well. Can you pick one? And if you have a packet of data, I think most folks can understand, at least most semi-technical folks can understand the concept of a packet of data.
Hmm.
If you have a packet of data, Explain what the protocol defines about the structure of that packet of data.
So so if we're going to talk about transport versus payload here, basically, my favorite analogy for this is, imagine I'm going to bring you a bucket of something. I have one piece that's the bucket. That's my protocol. It's how big is the bucket? Is it steel? Is it wood? Is it like whatever? Describe me the bucket and how I hand the bucket. How I take an empty bucket, fill the bucket, hand it to you, and how you empty the bucket. That's the protocol. The payload definition is what's in the bucket. So am I bringing you water, fish heads, a bucket full of peanut butter? I always like to use the most disgusting and memorable examples because it makes it
They'll be
stick more.
remembered. Yeah.
So no, you can't pick a protocol, because the protocols side of things, and by the way, I have pretty narrow knowledge of industrial protocols. So industrial is everything from oil and gas pipelines to power plants to car factories to the factories making the robots that make the cars to grid management to autonomous vehicles, mining, how the stoplights work. So there are variations in industrial across those different subdomains, and I don't know all of them at all, and I don't know all of them that well. So a lot of the stuff I know is broadly conceptual at the industrial layer, really broad, and then the stuff I know really really well is deep into making discrete parts. So this is generally things that start as a bar of metal and get turned into a usefully shaped piece of metal. That's the stuff I know the best, and that's where MQTT, OPC UA, MT-Connect, and a handful of others are kind of the predominant protocols. And only in the last 4-ish years did it start to become very important and very widely understood that dividing up the bucket from the fish heads was like needed to be done. So prior to that, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misrepresentation, or a lot of duplication, where we had a bucket that was the fish head bucket, we had a bucket that was the peanut butter bucket, and those things were tightly coupled together, because the problem everybody was trying to solve through the 2010s was like, oh, we can't connect to this equipment at all, and so you'd sort of solve all the pieces at once. Stuff is kind of shaken out more now, and so splitting up, how do we pass a packet as one dedicated piece of protocol, and it is generic to what the payload is, and then how do we define our payload? So how do we efficiently represent very very high frequency data, or how do we pick apart what's the most important data and the least important, so we're not crushing the protocol by trying to send too much data. And if I'm being honest, I mean, the way I expect this to go sometime in the future, if somebody would unearth these these comments I'm making about decoupling the protocol from the payload, somebody in the future is probably going to come back and be like, well, and then they decoupled the payload from the protocol, but it turns out there are differences in payload, so you really need a specialized protocol for all the payloads, and then the pendulum will swing back the other direction. But it won't repeat the same work, because the payload definitions that developed on their own. So am I talking about fish heads, peanut butter, voltages, documents, images, pictures, sound, part programs, whatever. Those payload definitions will get developed a lot. And then when the reconvergence comes back again and everything gets squished back together and we have another round of things in 10, 15 years, whatever, it'll be sort of like this upward spiral as opposed to an endless circle. It's the same thing with edge and cloud, right? Like, where's the edge? Nobody knows. Where's the cloud? There is no cloud. It's just somebody else's computer. Are we concerned with edge, cloud, distributed, whatever? Like, it's all the same, give and take over time.
So that's where we're headed. But I want to get to last. You sort of nicked the issue of competing protocols and the challenges associated with that, the problems that folks have trying to connect equipment, especially comprehensively. But I want to segue first into can you explain, sort of the Cisco industrial network protocol, where explain the layers, or sort of conceptually what this is called by Cisco? If you have at the asset layer, so think of, if someone talks about, layer 0 or the asset layer, they really mean where the equipment's working. So sort of, you're dealing with equipment, and then you move up, through the different levels of this. You mentioned edge and cloud, so talk about, sort of what Cisco defines those 7 layers as, sort of an overview of what you'll find through each layer, and then what's considered edge, what's considered cloud within that, sort of structure, that hierarchical structure. And then we'll segue into sort of what protocols for what layers, that sort of thing. But start with explaining what Cisco calls that, and kind of a quick synopsis of what each layer is.
They start with level 1 being physical, and then that's considered low is level 1, and then a higher level is layer 7. And I would say that the stuff, so I'll just name the stuff in between. The bottom layer is the physical layer, then you have a data link layer, then you have a network layer, then transport, which I was kind of using shorthand for a bunch of protocols, session layer, presentation layer, which adds syntax, and then your application layer, which is facing the end user. And of those, so this is because it's the OSI, open source interconnection 7-layer model. This is talking very explicitly about network equipment. So this whole stack, the 7-layer stack, the 7-layer burrito, if you will, or the 7-layer dip, uh, that 7-layer dip is sitting on top of some nachos of other layered stacks too, because we're only talking about the network device. So like if I have a industrial furnace that is connected to a network, whether that's a internal intranet or whether that is actually touching the capital I internet outside, either way, the OSA model is not concerned with whether that's an oven or whether it's a paint booth or whether it's a welder or anything else. It's only concerned with assuming generically data passing from place to place. Here's how we've got that set up. So did I answer your question?
Yeah.
And so the thing I would segue to is there's also the Purdue model, which I think is 4 layers or 5 layers, and based on ISA 95. And that is less about strictly the networking and more about sort of functional areas of an industrial application or a factory. And so if you already are in manufacturing or industry, then you are either already familiar with these things, or you know where to go to be familiar with them, or you know who in your organization is the right people that know them. If you're not in manufacturing, or if you are just getting started, or if this stuff is not, or if you don't have a frame of reference for these, it's not like you should go and memorize these networks. Like I didn't know all the 7 layers. I looked them up while you were asking me the question. But the piece that does matter is there are multiple ways you can look at these stacks of functions, and knowing what perspective you're taking and what reference you're taking for that perspective. So do I need the network perspective, OSI? Do I need the manufacturing and operations perspective, ISA 95 Purdue model? Do I need I don't know, pick another one, but that understanding that things are stacked on top of each other, and those stacks on top of each other are basically simplifications and mental models, and that they're not wildly different across domains for the most part. That's the piece you need to know, is like, think in terms of, well, how does this slot into this accepted understanding or this accepted framework or model?
So if you're in a conversation with someone and they repeatedly mention edge, edge, edge,
Yeah. Yeah.
where is that, and what does that mean?
I mean, this is not a cheeky or smart alecky answer. I literally ask, when you say edge, what are you referring to here? So there is, like, edge is kind of like digital twin. Edge is sort of over the hump where you can't just say edge and get away with it as a place on the network at this point. And the reason for this is, if I'm thinking from the perspective of an AWS server that sits in a server farm in Ashburn and serves the Mid-Atlantic, then the edge is a factory in Kentucky that is, nowhere near the middle of that network. But if I'm sitting in the office in the factory overseeing a bunch of equipment, then the edge might be a machine in that factory. But if I'm overseeing a manufacturing cell that has 6 machines in it, or an assembly line that has, say, a dozen PLCs in it, then that cell or assembly line is not the edge. Maybe the PLC is the edge, or maybe the controller is the edge. But if I'm looking at it from the perspective of the controller, then maybe the controller is not the edge. Maybe some sensor that talks to a PLC is the edge. And it kind of goes for infinity. And particularly coming from machine tools, most of the sensing, the things that machine tools do are actuation and sensing. And so on the actuation side, I can always say, well, the edge is the motor that runs this axis, or the ball screw that runs the ball screw, or the linear motor or whatever. That's the edge, because that's as far as you can get. And on the sensing side, I'm like, oh, well, the edge is that one temperature sensor that's on the spindle that sends a raw voltage that has to be interpreted. And unless you're talking about raw voltage from a temperature sensor, then that's not really the edge. So why are you even saying edge? And you can't compute on that one sensor, because that one sensor is basically just a thing that gets, bigger or smaller and sends voltage based on whether it expands from getting hot. So you don't do edge computing on a sensor in that sense, right? So I think that the term edge is usefully shorthand, in the sense that it means that you are pushing we talk about edge in the terms of edge computing. So it means you are pushing the ability to process information closer to that raw voltage and farther away from central server. That was a long-winded version of that answer, but I feel really comfortable with my answer there.
I think it's great, and I think we should have an entire session about edge and the edge computing, because that concept has been in the vernacular for 10 years now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you feel like it's come and gone? I feel like it's like the world's moved on, kind of.
So I can talk about this. My former employer, Johnson Controls, made an acquisition of an edge AI company called Foghorn. And
when was that?
This was like 2 years ago.
Oh, I didn't realize they got bought by JCI. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, so, conceptually, yes. Conceptually, the ability to run pre-trained models in some cluster on the edge reduces the latency for decision making. So the closer you are to where the thing's happening, the quicker the math is being run. You're not pushing data to a cloud and then pushing a response back. There's a lag there that you can avoid with edge computing. But then the question becomes, what problems get solved with that? And inevitably, the situation I just mentioned, or any other, edge computing suffers from the same constraints in a data situation. Now, if you're running heuristics, absolutely. The quicker, if you've got heuristics that are guiding your process, the closer you can get that to the process, the better. But if you're using algorithms to make decisions on data, you still have the same constraints that you would have in a cloud environment. You have to train, you have to take into consideration all the potential variances, the non-linearities in that process. So it's an architecture that conceptually makes sense, but just like everything else, the problems that it is supposed to solve or have solved are real hard to do. And so you know, there's a there's I think there's room for that concept or that practice, but to actually execute it is another thing.
Well, a little bit of definition goes a long way in this space. So when I play a game of AI or not with you, I feel like there's so many open-ended places that don't come to any kind of meaningful conclusion, and I end up lost. But when you say it was a vendor that does AI at the edge, I know what you mean. I mean,
Yeah.
that's specified enough to mean all the things you just said. The AI part means there is some sort of algorithmic control or learning or processing going on. So
Here's the
that's
best
what. Yeah, go ahead.
here's the best example, and then finish this out. This is the best example of edge computing that there is: autonomous vehicles. So you have, I love the example of Tesla just because they have probably assimilated the largest army of the smartest people in the world. They have really bright engineers. They have the top hardware and software capabilities at their disposal.
Mm-hmm.
And so an autonomous car is taking either LiDAR or vision in the case of Tesla, or both. It's taking in sensor inputs in real time and in
Mm-hmm.
milliseconds is making decisions about what the car's supposed to do based on those inputs. Now, there are also heuristics involved in hard coded processes, but again, the constraints are the same in that the algorithm today is only as good as the data that it's been trained on.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter how fast or how complex or how well that edge computing system works. It's still, it's still at the mercy of the constraints of training algorithms to make decisions. And that is the edge computing of data science. There's also edge computing of heuristics and coded logic, and there are plenty of examples of that being successful all across the industrial space.
I think you and I have a small disagreement about uh well, let's just say it's about expertise and know-how. So in my like when I hear it's an edge AI, or yeah, when I hear it's an edge AI service or platform or whatever, when you're talking about Tesla, I am immediately shortcutting this into bite-sized digestible chunks, and it basically in my mind comes out as Tesla process data at car, not at cloud, right? And like that's as far as I take it, right? And my assumption is if and when I need to know more than that, I'll go on Wikipedia. And when that's insufficient, then I'll come back and keep learning about it as I need to know it. But I think that like learning agility and the ability to pick up on new concepts matters a lot, but that also depends on being willing to be somewhat comfortable just kind of not knowing, and then knowing how far you should take your knowledge and conclusions, and then also uh I don't know, just not getting hung up on the fact that you don't know this, that, or the other thing about this, that, or the other topic. So focusing on the stuff you don't know, as opposed to focusing on the stuff you do know, and worrying about it is bad. But also having the expectation that I don't know, like a lot more about how the AI would operate for self-driving mode for Tesla than I do, and there's always the risk of getting frustrated that all these bozos don't know how anything works, right? And it's true, the bozos don't know how anything works, but even the non-bozos don't know how anything works either. Like
For sure.
nobody knows how anything works. there's the there's the one guy that knows how it works, and everybody else doesn't know how it works, and that one guy is, if they're an engineer, they're frustrated with the fact that nobody else gets it except them.
Yeah. Yeah. So explain, we talked about edge. So if edge is, and maybe this is like, explaining what a circle is, but so what? If edge is closer to the thing, the process, the car, the controller, the whatever, cloud is what?
Somebody else's computer, and that's
Yes.
like I think that's very tongue in cheek, and I am very much not a network engineer. And I have heard recently, when making that tongue-in-cheek remark, that I am full of it and misrepresenting cloud. But then I didn't really process the whole explanation of how I was wrong, unfortunately. So I end up back at the same place.
Where it still sounds like a good tongue-in-cheek response, because it kind
As
of
soon
is.
as I heard the term local cloud, then I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
So
Like it's the extra, the nice thing about words and terms and definitions and things like that is it's okay if it's not sufficiently defined, and sufficiently defined for purpose is usually good enough. So for for a dinner time conversation or a dinner party conversation, somebody else's computer and snide remarks and bumper sticker level is totally fine. And if I'm in a room talking about a system architecture for how we're going to make an autonomous forklift, the word cloud isn't going to come up after the first conversation. We're going to start drawing blocks on where things happen. And when we talk about processing, we're not going to say edge computing. We're going to say the processing happens on the forklift control system, or we're going to say the processing happens uh, on the server that exists inside the facility, or we're going to say that the processing happens in AWS. And even then, it's, the assumption of on AWS, the network engineers could come in and say, well, that's not specific enough either. Like, tell me exactly what that means when you say on AWS. And when you look at these, we brought up the OSI model. Every stack up or every architectural model always has other pieces that aren't there, because the whole point of a model is to make it simpler than reality. So reality always contains extra pieces. If I do a model of Terry's neighborhood and it includes Terry's house but not Terry, so what? But when you see that model that's that model of your neighborhood and it has your house in it, you're mentally filling in. Oh, there's the house where I live. Oh, there's the house where Bob lives. Oh, there's the house where other Terry lives. Oh, and you can fill in the gaps, and you're mentally picturing kind of below the end of the model. You're picturing what comes next in that model, and that's totally reasonable and perfectly fine. And everybody thinks that way all the time.
so there are we like to tease out sort of the human aspects of technology, and we're talking about industrial protocols. What are the, because there are some spicy beefs that you can wade into on which protocol is best and why. What are
I have two amazingly spicy pieces of this, and one we're gonna have to come back to another time, because it to cover in more detail, because it's a full. I mean, it could be hours and hours long, and it's actually much spicier. So that one I won't tease it anymore. Where there are agreed upon national or internet or industry national or international standards, where there's some sort of a sanctioning body that says this is the set of rules and this is how protocol XYZ works, in every single case where that exists, there are companies and individuals who are able to use that for sort of devious manipulative gain and lack of, and keeping things status quo, as opposed to, moving the needle forward and expanding technology. And the way that is done most often is to, participate and, say, yes, we love the international standard. I didn't know I could do that. Yes, we love the international standard. Uh, but it's just too expensive to also support this, or our customers just need it too fast. So we're going to go ahead and do our own thing. And then, you send your least good people to go and participate, and then they contribute badly. And now we're into the whole like CIA sabotage model. So that's the longer one. And that needs like a much longer discussion. The shorter one is actually more heated, because that stuff, all like, no emotions don't flare over that. It just looks like stagnation versus progress, and people get frustrated, but the frustrated people just walk away and go do something else. And the people that, quote unquote, won by sandbagging a standards body, like, they have slightly more profit at their company that quarter, but nobody like pops champagne to celebrate that they've won in that manner. The other side of it is really, I think, mostly uh, horrible communication skills amplified through public forums. And what I mean by that is discussions like fitment to purpose or functional gaps, where it's just simple stuff like, is it the bucket or the fish heads? You could argue with me until you're blue in the face about why water is superior to fish heads, and I could argue with you until I'm blue in the face about why a wooden bucket is superior to fish heads. And the problem here is that you're talking about fish heads versus water, and I'm talking about water. I'm talking about fish heads versus bucket. It's not even a comparison. And the correct way that a one individual team of engineers or practitioners of some kind, the way they would sort this out effectively, and in a functioning manner, was they would set out a trade study and they'd say, here are some traits, here are some characteristics on one axis, and here's score and ranking on the other axes. And if you're ranking buckets, and one of my points about fish heads is how smelly they are, you just put smelliness on one axis, and then you put a check for, is the bucket smelly? And if wooden buckets and steel buckets don't have anything to do with smelliness, then you put fish heads on there and you say they're smelly, and you move on, and it becomes obvious to everyone who's watching this exercise that the smelliness of fish heads is not in conflict with the water tightness of a bucket, right? And so there are tools and techniques for problem solving and requirements gathering and specification building that already exist, are extremely well established in both manufacturing space and Harvard Business Review and airport bookshops across the world. And those things aren't applied when you're just having a pissing match with somebody on the internet. And if you don't know them personally, and if they're not, cautious and diplomatic about the way they phrase things, you can get endless threads of apples versus oranges that just don't make any sense at all when you pick back one or two layers of it. And they tend to devolve because there's also not clear rules of polite or effective engagement. And to be very blunt about this, in my opinion, everybody loves a good fight on the internet. That somewhere deep inside everybody is that I got them now.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that everybody does it all the time, but it's a temptation dwelling in all of us wanting to
So
bust out
what
of our keyboard.
what are the problems associated, like the real tangible problems in industry associated with a lack of harmony in industrial protocols? So no harmonization of the ability to pass and, more importantly, store data or read
Mm-hmm.
data into storage environments so you can manipulate that data for some sort of advantage.
It's all speed and price. So things that would be fast are slow, and things that could be cheap are expensive. And there are other reasons why things move slower and cost more in industry than they do elsewhere. So, if my iPhone, like if there's a software bug in my iPhone and it means I can't take a picture, or even if I lose all the pictures I've ever had of the birth of my children, and I'm very sad, nobody's dead. If the same thing happens in a jet engine and the plane falls out of the sky, that's a bigger problem. So a certain amount of conservatism is innate and important and valuable, and it can become very difficult to ascertain, certainly from the outside. I don't know, maybe it's easier from the outside, but maybe not. It can be hard to tell whether stagnation and slowness is from careful deliberation and taking a conservative approach to safety assurance and regulatory compliance, or if the slowness is coming from just a general complacency and technological behindness.
So I'm asking more. I'm asking more for, if I've got this manufacturing plant, and in
Mm-hmm.
my manufacturing plant, I make seats,
Yeah.
chairs, whatever,
Yeah.
seats.
Airplane seats or car seats or something else.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Airplane.
Yeah, airplane seats that smell like fish heads.
Fair enough. It was in the spec.
It was in the spec. It was in the spec. So I have, this is what we make. It's not a big plant, but it takes hundreds of pieces of equipment to automate the production of these fish smelling seats that
Yeah.
go on airplanes.
Hmm.
So I've got 25 vendors, let's say, that make all the equipment, different pieces of equipment. I've got, you know, a bunch of vendors that make all the equipment, because we're not going to buy just one person's stuff, because if all the stuff goes to junk in 1 quarter, then it shuts my plant down. So I want to buy the lowest cost thing that does the best job for me. So we shop for a bunch of different stuff.
Yep.
Now, these vendors don't agree on what protocol they're going to use when they send their equipment out into the world. They don't get together and agree and say, our friends that are making fish smelling airplane seats want to use this protocol. Let's all make this OPCUA or MQTT or MT Connect or whatever. We're all going to send our equipment in with this protocol.
Hmm.
So you end up with, if it has an industrial protocol, if you have the ability to pass data, chances are you're not going to have harmony with all of the equipment that you have and what protocol it uses to pass data, or even a couple layers up. So you have a dissonance of your ability to store data because you're not using the same protocol. What problems does that cause?
So in my opinion, I'm not deflecting or dodging the question here, but in my opinion, in my experience, one of the things that's most fascinating about this is how much it's not a digital problem. It's a standardization problem. And there are two sides. So if we all say, let's go with fire hydrants. So let's say we have standard connections on fire hydrants for the entire United States. Having a standard connection across the entire United States means that the total amount of money spent on fire hydrant connections will theoretically go down. There will be economies of scale. You will have the ability to pass a fire truck from Terry's fire department in Kentucky to Russ's fire department in Virginia, and the wheels of commerce can continue to turn. That's the pros. The downside of this is if the United States has standardized on firefighter hydrant protocol 123, and there is a technological advancement that makes for a better version of that protocol, there is no easy or fast way to tear out all the old and put in new, and there's no easy and fast way to respond to interest or demand for a new standard. So the idea of having a fire hydrant that supports 123 or whatever numbers I said, and then next to it another fire hydrant that has a different connector on it that Terry's fire department spent extra on, and also now has duplicate connectors. That standardization versus innovation problem is universal, whether we're talking about communication protocol or physical standards or business practice standards. So I think you were asking like what goes wrong when it's not standard. So I mean, back to in the digital space and the factory space that you're talking about, what goes wrong is you know contracts are long for software when they would otherwise potentially be shorter. That's good for whoever gets the contract, but bad for the customer who, they might just want an open API and be able to put a different set of reporting on it. And they might want to, shop around for a different vendor every 6 months because their reporting needs have changed. But the underlying data infrastructure needs are exactly the same. So please just have, keep the data part standard, and we just want new reporting. So lack of choice, vendor lock-in, which is not exactly the same as lack of choice. It's more like inability to adjust on the fly and overemphasizing one purchase decision with an uncertain future. And then it generally discourages new entrants to bring new technology. So if I've got to use the fire hydrant analogy, if I already know that the that there's no standard and there are 1,000 different protocols for fire hydrants, even if I have a great new protocol for fire hydrants, or say I have a better hose, that's a better example. So I have a better hose, but there's 1,000 different ways I have to connect that hose to a fire hydrant. I am at most, I'm going to get 1/1000th of the market unless I spend my time on making connectors to all these different types of fire hydrants. And so my hose might be good enough to be really, really worthwhile if I didn't have to spend time on all these extra connections. But when I have to spend time on the extra connections, my hose, which, it's going to save lives and put out fires faster, but I have to spend my time on making the hose good, not on making the way it connects to the fire hydrants good. And that same thing happens in like everywhere in IT.
That was what I was trying to tease out. Is
I got there eventually.
Yeah. No, it's great. That's I think in a nutshell, that's the problem with when people chest thump and get spicy about their defending their protocol of choice. Ultimately, the problem is that you can't solve problems. And you have to solve multiple problems to solve, instead of being better at doing what it is that you're trying to do, whether it's making a piece of equipment run better or reduce the scrap that your process produces because you can do some analytics. You have to spend more of your mind share just trying to connect to all the different pieces and parts that would go into a data collection scheme.
Well,
And I think
I'm sure you're gonna be shocked here that I have a somewhat contrarian, nuanced view of this. But I think that the zealotry about a technology, regardless of what it is, on one hand, I think that in general it doesn't serve the fitment to purpose and the problem solving. So if I'm more worried about supporting, I don't know, Terry X as the protocol, and all I can talk about is how important Terry X is, and I'm like single-minded Captain Ahab on a whale. I gotta get Terry X into every factory, because think of all the things that we'll solve once it's standardized. That ends up eventually like missing the actual point, because either the world moves on or you're successful, but you're still kind of hanging on to Terry X as opposed to whatever the problem was you were trying to solve in the first place. So that's one side of it. But then the other side of it is, if an entire industry or a whole market didn't have any zealots, then you'd never get any standardization done in the first place. Yeah. So the zealots are both necessary and self-defeating.
I agree.
Very complex.
Well, I think you've, in wrapping a bow around it, I think you've done a marvelous job explaining what a protocol is and sort of what the problems are with a lack of harmonization. I think we need to come back to some, nooks and crannies that were brought up in this conversation and double click at some point.
I want to talk about the expertise piece. I'm not super old, but I'm early middle-aged at this point, and I get concerned about my level of knowledge here, because I feel like I barely know any of it. Like I don't know the OSA model off the top of my head. I don't know the network protocols. I saw a slide 2 days ago that somebody presented, and had the entire slide was protocols, and I knew 2 of them. Right. And these are industrial protocols, right? It's not like these are far, far afield from where my subject matter expertise is. So then I'm like panicking, because if I know a lot about this stuff, and it seems like very few people I run into have my level of understanding, then how the heck are we ever going to, reach the future? But now we go back to what I said at the beginning about, fear of all those bozos not knowing what they're doing.
So we'll have on, maybe as soon as next week, we'll have on, there are people that at a higher level are really expert at the networking part of, I have a colleague and friend, you'll love this guy. He's a mechanical engineer, and he's a controls engineer from way back. But really knows like dirt under the fingernails about pushing data around in industrial networks. And he'd be a good person to get sort of the I don't really care about the protocol. I care about being able to get data out of equipment. He'd be a good person to go to walk through on that. So I'll see what we can get on that. Are you going to take us out?
Yeah, and I'm also going to say that in the future, AI is going to solve this and write all of our protocols for us. All the converters will be AI.
It's possible.
Bye, Terry.
Have a good one.